You're live.
Great, well listen, thank you once again for asking me to contribute. I think it's kind of becoming an annual event that I come along and give you a bit of an update. And I guess for those of you who don't know me, I'm Steve Masson, I'm one of the liver consultants here. I'm also currently lead for the kind of NIHR CRN Hepatology for the North East and North Cumbria. And that's a bit about research delivery, and I guess that's partly why I'm asked every year to come and give you a bit of an update as to where we are with research. I guess you've just seen kind of research in progress really with Jenny's ideas about setting up research and some of the obstacles and barriers that we have to think about, and it's not always natural to kind of perhaps include all that setup and those steps when you're thinking about doing research. So that I guess the kind of outline for what I wanted to think about was a project that I've been involved with, that I think some of you were involved with, about what the UK research priorities are or perhaps should be. A little bit about how we're doing in the North East, here in Newcastle and more widely. And then talk you through some of the projects that we've been involved in, particularly my involvement, so that I can give you some kind of personal experience there, but also some of the other successes that we've had here. So this was a project that I've been involved with for the last kind of 4 or 5 years, and it's kind of hot off the press. And really what it's been trying to do is look at what we feel the top research priorities in liver and gallbladder disorders in the UK should be. And it was something that we started kind of 4 or 5 years ago, and it was done through the National Institute for Health Research, the James Lind Alliance. I don't know if any of you have heard of this James Lind Alliance. First of all, does anybody know who James Lind was?
Famed naval surgeon.
He was, yeah, he's a very famous Scottish. All the best people are Scottish.
Vitamin C and scurvy.
Exactly, and
yes.
he gave vitamin C to his sailors that had scurvy, and that was kind of the first example of, I guess, research. And he thought of the idea, delivered it, and then had a very good outcome. And so the James Lind Alliance was set up about 15 years ago, and basically it kind of takes various disease areas in turn and tries to figure out what the research priority should be, and rather than doing it from kind of the healthcare professional's perspective, is trying to do it perhaps from patients, carers, and the more general population. And so a few of us got together and thought, well, this would be really helpful to do in liver disease, and we split it up into alcohol and alcohol-related liver disease, and then non-alcohol and other liver disease. And we kind of invited, really through patient support groups, through internet, online surveys, we invited people to submit what they thought unanswered research questions in liver disease would be. And I think we got about 126 patients and carers, along with 13 healthcare professionals in the first round, to try and identify as many different questions as they could. And through that online survey process, we came up with just over 200 what we felt were unidentified questions. And then one of my colleagues who was leading this in London, who's a professor of evidence-based medicine, then went kind of through all the literature, all the PubMed searches to try and figure out if there were other unanswered questions that might be relevant. And they came up with about 400 unique kind of questions. And then basically we kind of whittled them down into what we thought were kind of about 50 potential research priorities, and then kept sending them out online to the people that had committed to keep continuing to review them. And basically what would happen is you'd get the questions and you'd have to kind of say how important you thought this was, and then that would be the first round. The facilitator would then look and say, give you your answers back and say, well, everyone else thought it was more important or less important than you, and eventually you kind of reach a consensus as to what you think the important ones are. And we've come out with the top 10, and we'll see if you agree. So this is kind of an example. So for example, when we first put this online and said, please give us what you think is an unanswered research question, and one of the ones, for example, that came back would be, what is the best immune suppressive regimen for patients who have undergone a liver transplant? And we got about, as I say, 430 questions like that. But we're kind of able to break them down, and I guess this is, when you start thinking about what a research question is, you start thinking, well, there's the patient group or the population to whom it might apply, so that could be the general population, it could be
people that eat too much, people that don't exercise. There's the intervention, so that might be the specific treatment that you want to give. There's what you might do if you don't give the intervention, so that might be nothing, or it might be something completely different. And then I guess there's how you're going to measure the research, so whether it improves quality of life, whether it improves mortality, whether it slows down the disease, improves the symptoms. So I guess on that thought, if you didn't have the chance to kind of do it first time round, before I show you what we think were the top 10, have you got any kind of suggestions or research questions that come to mind, either from your own experience, friends' experience, relative experience? Is there anything that comes to mind that any of you might like to have seen on that top 10 list?
Questions asked the patient.
Sorry?
Questions that the patient,
so
would
patient,
like to be asked.
a carer, a healthcare professional, what kind of research, what do you think would be, if you had to say this is the top priority that we should be researching currently in liver disease, what would you?
What is being done at this current stage for my condition?
Yep, yeah. Okay, fair enough, yep. And up behind, yeah.
Treatments for each.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what are the best treatments for H?
Yeah.
Overall, or in a particular condition, or no? Any other kind of?
The national, which I think you probably did show on the board there, which would be sort of detecting it early enough, or that I'm guessing it's to do with the biomarkers, you know,
Yeah.
the people who are more likely to progress through the disease.
Yeah. So how do we identify?
How do you identify
those
them, and how
Yeah.
ultimately the cure? You know, if it's not lifestyle changes, then is there something? So
Yeah.
I'm guessing that's already there.
Okay. Any other?
I think alcohol-related liver disease and education for younger people coming up.
Okay. So how would we educate younger people about safe drinking, or that kind of thing?
Prevention's always better than cure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is a type 2 diabetic more likely to have a fatty liver?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good question.
What the research could be, how it could correlate with, you know, diabetes
Yeah.
and liver disease. How they correlate? Do they correlate? Are you more likely to have it if you're diabetic?
Yeah. I think those are all fantastic. So we show you what we did actually come up with. So these were the top 10, and as I say, this was the ones that we eventually kind of reached by consensus of healthcare professionals, patients, carers, all going through this kind of prioritising and then agreeing. And this was in order. So the top 10 were, I don't know if you can read them all, but I'll run through them quickly. What's the best
Can I just
treatment?
ask you, Steve, was
Yeah.
PBC mentioned? Because, I mean, there's more PBC than PSC.
So there's,
No, there's more PBC than PSC, isn't it?
Yes, but they do. So there's a variety of things featured. So the top one is about treatment for early liver cancer.
Yeah.
The next one is about curing or delaying the progression of PSC. The next one is best treatments in NAFLD. The next one is about immune suppression in adults going with liver transplant. The next one is how you educate the public about NAFLD. What are the treatments that cure or delay autoimmune hepatitis? What are the treatments that cure or delay NASH, non-alcohol steatohepatitis? Before liver transplant, is it better to put the organ on cold storage or machine perfusion? That's quite topical at the moment. What are the best treatments that cure or delay PBC? And then are there any treatments that reverse the liver damage in PSC? So I don't know if that's surprising or if that's what you might expect.
I expected nothing less, considering Martin Wallensley was part of the committee.
Absolutely.
Well, you know, and that, I guess there's a very valid point or controversy even in that. And then I guess the whole point in having these research questions is to think, well, what do we go on and do about them? And this is when it starts to get a bit more kind of ambitious, because I guess there could only be a treatment uncertainty if there hadn't already been a very good randomised controlled trial that was repeated and validated that everyone agreed was the best treatment. And so I guess you kind of come on to think, well, what's the current state of the literature?
Some of them have never been reviewed in the literature, so we really don't know where we are. Have there been any randomised controlled trials, which are always considered the best quality of evidence? So you give somebody one treatment but they don't know what they're getting, you give somebody different treatment but they don't know what they're getting, and then you follow them prospectively. And actually from this, I guess we've got a series of trials, a series of potential research studies that we might want to do. I guess the realistic side of this is, how do we fund all of this? Do we have enough resources? How do we lead all of this? And because they cover lots of different areas, there's liver cancer, there's PSC, there's PBC, NASH, NAFLD, there's going to be a huge amount of work to answer all of these. But at least we've got some kind of sense of perhaps what we should be trying. There was also in parallel a kind of similar process going on for alcohol, and again they came up with I guess top 10, and some of that I guess speaks to what Joan was asking, what the most effective ways to stop drinking, educate, how should we do that in the community, patients' experience of having alcohol-related liver disease, more effective strategies, the stigma, does that affect the willingness of people, interventions, depression in alcohol, how do you manage one or the other? So there's a whole host of things. And actually the BSG, who are kind of the specialist society that represent most of the healthcare professionals, gastroenterology, liver, have committed to really trying to address at least 4 or 5 of these over the next number of years. So there is some progress being made, and we would like to think that it has had much more, I guess, patient public buy-in from the outset this time in terms of defining what the priorities should be. So that was a kind of national bit that we've been involved with. If we look then at what's happening here, we historically have been one of the better areas for recruitment in the UK, so hepatology in the North East, North Cumbria. And we've gone from, I guess, relatively small numbers, building it right up. The numbers do seem to have dropped, and this is just looking at numbers of people that recruit or that take part in a study. I think it's fair to say that in the last couple of years the studies have become more complex, so actually numbers of patients being recruited is not necessarily the best surrogate of the best quality of research, and sometimes there'll be studies that take a lot of time and effort, an interventional study, whereas for example the years that we got huge numbers, that was a questionnaire kind of observational thing, which I'm not saying it's any less important, but it's easier to do to some extent rather than perhaps some of the interventional studies that we're doing now. And actually, when we look compared to the rest of the UK, so we were top for overall recruitment 16-17, we remained near the top 17-18, and still, apart from Scotland, who did fantastically well that year, we're certainly one of the higher recruiting areas. And I always put this in to say, but actually it's thanks to the people that volunteer and are willing to go into these studies. That's the only reason we can have league tables like this. And so actually we're always very grateful for patients to take part. And this is just to say that we're still national leaders. This is a picture of me and our specialty lead. And actually each year we still kind of win various awards for being the highest recruiter, the fastest time to recruitment to time and target. So there are other metrics by which we do pretty well. And if we look at the studies that had been recruiting, and most of them probably still are over the next financial year, we've got a lot of different studies open in the North East, and they cover a variety, hopefully aiming to cover all types of liver disease. So the top ones for liver cancer, EPOS, Jenny has alluded to, is for fatty liver. There's the autoimmune liver disease cohort. There's another study we're doing in NAFLD, quite a few actually you'll see feature NAFLD or NASH. Hepatitis B, PBC, PSC, Hemochromatosis, immunosuppression. So we're trying to cover the whole range, and actually we're one of the, I guess, one of the few centres that are able to probably offer all those studies. And you think, well, why do we do all this? Why are we doing, and obviously it's how we advance medicine, it's how we're able to offer treatments now and in the future that we weren't able to offer previously. But there are additional benefits, and the kind of things that have become apparent in the last couple of years is that if you are looked after in a hospital that does a lot of research, actually your outcomes are better And it's not entirely clear why that might be. It might be that the hospitals that invest in research are also investing in other things that are good for your health. It might be that if you're looked after in a hospital where the consultants and the healthcare professionals are really interested in research, they might be more up to date with how to treat things optimally. And I just kind of always highlight that it's probably no coincidence that Newcastle Hospitals is now outstanding for the second time, and historically has been top of the league tables in terms of numbers of studies ongoing and number of patients being recruited. Disappointingly, with Newcastle Hospital, I think, dropped to 3rd place this year, and Guy's and Tommy's were the top, and then Oxford. But we'd held that top place for the last 7 or 8 years in general, so I think the two are probably correlated. If we then think about some of the specific or local studies that we've been involved with, I'm going to start with hemochromatosis, because I remember last year when I mentioned this, it was actually the thing that probably got the most interest at the end of the meeting. It was a bit rushed. I thought, well, if I start with this one this time, it gives a bit more time. Hemochromatosis is a genetic condition where people who have this genetic abnormality are more susceptible to, or more likely to accumulate iron as they go through life. And every time they eat something that's got a little bit of iron in it, they absorb more iron than people who don't have this genetic mutation. And eventually, not all, but eventually a proportion of people with this genetic mutation, this genetic hemochromatosis, will go on to develop too much iron. And too much iron in various parts of the body can be bad, so it can be toxic to a number of organs. And so everybody need iron, because you have to have iron to produce hemoglobin, which is the main oxygen carrier. So you need iron for the hemoglobin to get round your body, but normally that is regulated so that you don't have too much. Whereas if you've got this genetic mutation, then your body iron can be 4 or 5 times what it should be. And there are anecdotal stories of people with this condition, for example, going through airport scanners and setting them off because their total body iron has been so high that it's been detected there. And it seems that the liver is probably the most sensitive organ to iron, and so you go on to develop fibrosis or cirrhosis, but also the pancreas, joints and the heart can be susceptible to that as well. And if you go back to kind of, the researchers of the 18 or 1900s, they had recognised this. They didn't know anything about genetics in those days, but they saw these kind of, what they described as bronzed diabetics with cirrhosis, because the bronzing came from pigment that was being deposited because of iron being deposited in the pituitary, the diabetes because of the iron being deposited in the pancreas, and then the cirrhosis because of the iron being deposited in the liver. But actually, if people were only being identified at that stage, that's far too late nowadays, because actually we can intervene before any of those end organ damage things occur. And actually, if you move to where we're at now, we now know the gene, which is called HFE, which is high ferritin, and that accounts for nearly all the patients that have this genetic hemochromatosis. And one of the really surprising things, or things that people find really surprising, is actually about 1 in 8 of North European Caucasians will have this, or be a carrier for this genetic mutation. It's autosomal recessive, which means actually you need 2 copies of the abnormal gene before it really affects you. So although 1 in 8 are carriers, it means that about 1 in 200 people will actually have the genetic predisposition to the disease. And actually, as a result of this, we've had a much better understanding of how this comes about. And this is just to show that if, for example, the commonest situation will be that 2 carriers, because 1 in 8 of the population of carriers then have child, and there'll be a 1 in 4 chance that they could go on to develop hemochromatosis. There's a 2 in 4 chance that they were likely to be carriers, and then there's a 1 in 4 chance that they'd be wild type or have the normal genetic, normal healthy gene. So one of the things I was involved with last year was got invited to Westminster. I don't know if you've ever been to the Houses of Parliament, and this was to do with the Hemochromatosis Society, who were launching their report and trying to generate some interest. And actually, as a result of this, there's now an all-party parliamentary group who are kind of raising the profile of hemochromatosis in the UK. And this was a large survey that we were involved with, asking people with hemochromatosis the kind of symptoms and problems that they were having from their condition. I've said it's a North European Caucasian disease, and as you'll see, so most of the respondents came from the red, but there were other respondents who came from the blue area, so North America, Australia, South Africa, so kind of the places that I guess historically the North Europeans have moved to, so the people of that genetic makeup have moved to. There were a lot of ongoing symptoms amongst patients, particularly things like arthralgia, so joint pain, fatigue, but lots of other things that perhaps we don't always think of: skin problems, abdominal pains, psychological cognitive difficulties. So this has been really kind of insightful in terms of the additional burden that something like this might have. And our treatment with hemochromatosis has historically been a bit medieval, to be honest. The body is designed in an odd way that you can absorb iron, but you've not got any way of getting rid of it, apart from through bleeding. And so still, the mainstay of treatment is for people to come in and have pints of blood removed, and that will reliably bring their total iron levels down as they have more venesection or phlebotomies. And if people are otherwise fit and well, then one of the things that we've done locally is encourage people, if they want, rather than have the blood taken off here in the hospital, to have it at the blood donor service. And actually, when we've been running this programme, we've got quite a lot of people who prefer to donate their blood through the blood donor service, and then obviously it can be used in a very good way, and we've really led on that locally. But the reason I put this in is that actually we've now got one of the largest hemochromatosis clinics in the UK, and as a result of that we're asked to lead on this international trial where there was a synthetic drug, and it's this molecule called hepcidin, which we've now understood kind of regulates how iron gets absorbed and metabolized in the body, in the sense that if you don't have enough hepcidin, you'll absorb a lot of iron, and if you've got too much hepcidin, you'll become iron deficient. And so there was a pharmaceutical company who designed a synthetic version of this, and we've been running a study here in Newcastle and in the rest of the UK, where people who were eligible were asked, rather than just having their phlebotomy, if they would have this injection, and they were having the injection weekly for either 12 or 16 weeks, depending on some of their indices. And the study has recruited as many patients as it was going to. So I think there was about 60 patients internationally, 10 in the UK, some here in Newcastle, and actually there was a press release just earlier in the month saying that actually this drug seems to work. So the study hasn't been analysed completely, and it's a bit unusual for the pharmaceutical company to make an announcement like that, particularly while the study's ongoing, but it's there in the public domain, and it does seem that we have added potentially to the treatment options for patients with this condition. So I guess it's kind of watch this space, and this is work that has been done here in Newcastle and that we're leading on, so I think that's really exciting.
Is hepticin a natural phenomenon? Is it?
Yeah, so it is a kind of peptide hormone that is naturally produced that we've only really known about since we've been able to define the genetics of hemochromatosis. We've only been able to identify that it's the kind of regulator of how iron is absorbed and digested through the body. So it's not something that perhaps 15 or 20 years ago we had any clue about, but we've got a bit more information on that.
Interesting. I have liver disease, but it's NASH. But I also have every 2 years I need to top up with iron.
Right, yeah.
So, and I always ask my hepatologist, could it have something to do with the liver? You know, because I've had all the tests, you know. But
so there is an interaction in it, because the liver is such, I guess, a big store of where the iron normally is stored. And it does seem that hepcidin does have an interaction. So we know that, for example, among certain patients with very advanced liver disease, the hepcidin levels are probably different than in patients who don't have any liver disease. So there's probably a secondary effect happening in different types of liver disease, rather than what's happening here. But it does seem, because quite often we'll get raised iron levels or raised ferritin levels in patients with NASH or who drink too much, and it's something to do with what hepatologist is doing to the liver. So there is an interaction, but we don't yet know what that is, I'm afraid.
More research.
More research, exactly. The other, I'm happy to take any questions as we go along, so please do interrupt. The other area that I'm really interested in is alcohol. And I guess in this part of the world it's probably one of the commonest things that we see. I don't know if you saw, this was just, I think, last month. I think it was quite widely over social media. Although it was actually a relatively old study and looking at kind of what are the most dangerous drugs. And we always think, quite rightly, of heroin being bad and crack cocaine being bad. And undoubtedly they're very harmful. But if you look at overall harm to society, then alcohol, and it's really because I guess it's so widespread, whereas heroin and crack cocaine are very bad for the people that are taking it, but fortunately not many people take it, whereas I guess a lot of people drink too much alcohol. So the overall amount of harm, and that's not just health harm, there will be crime, social harm, economic harm as well. But that really kind of tells us why, I guess, alcohol is important. And then also if you look, I guess, at kind of geographically, and this is to do with alcohol-related admissions to hospital, but I could show you the same for deaths from alcohol or whatever. It's a very similar picture. The darker the colour, the higher the rates really. And you'll see that it's really northeast, northwest, little bits of London that have by far the highest rates of alcohol-related admissions and deaths from liver disease, and that's something that's not changing. I guess what's even more interesting is if you look at a kind of Newcastle-based level, and it's kind of the similar key. The darker areas are where more of our admissions relating to alcohol are coming from. And this is just Newcastle. And the reason that we did this, and the reason that there's a bit in red there, is because we were meeting with the Newcastle Central MP, whose constituency that covers, and we were trying to really raise the point about that having a very high rate of alcohol admissions. So it tends to be round here rather than East Gosforth, Parklands, for example. Perhaps what you might anticipate, because actually you could put a very similar map up of employment, of socio-economic, of lots of things which would correlate with that. The kind of worrying thing to my mind is that if you look, and I do, like, now how much research has been done on alcohol, that's the lower one, and then how much research has been done on NASH, for example. This is just putting them into one of the search engines to look at how many papers are published each year. Then it's still, we're saying it's the most harmful drug that's causing a lot of deaths, and yet NASH has become sexy, whereas perhaps alcohol hasn't.
It's definitely not sexy.
It's not sexy.
I guarantee it's not sexy.
But you know what I mean. I guess it's becoming topical, perhaps.
You could put on a t-shirt, couldn't you?
Yeah, NASH is sexy.
Yeah, I've got a t-shirt. That's a good idea.
One of the things that I've been interested in is why some people that drink develop liver problems, whereas other people that drink don't. And most people who drink heavily will develop some fat inside the liver. That's just the body's response to too much alcohol. It doesn't get stored as alcohol, it doesn't get stored as carbohydrate, it gets stored as fat. But it's actually a smaller number that go on to develop more advanced liver disease, fibrosis, cirrhosis, and then the other things that we worry about with alcohol. And then there's this other kind of acute presentation. That's people who might drink very heavily for a period of time, can become very ill very quickly, jaundiced, and require admission to hospital. And this is this alcohol hepatitis. So that is, I guess, what, in a nutshell, what we mean by alcohol-related liver disease. And this is, again, kind of quite hot off the press. This was a study that we did with some other centres in the UK to try and figure out what happened to people that had biopsy proven various stages of alcohol-related liver disease. And this was really just a literature review looking, and initially we identified about 46,000 studies. So having said there's no research on alcohol, we found a lot of studies, but actually there were only about 24 of those, and then I think we came up with 37, sorry, in the end. And I think the reason I was asked to be involved is that one of the studies was something that we did a few years ago, where we looked at the risks of dying, a little bit like what Jenny was describing. So we looked at historical biopsies from the 80s and 90s, and then followed people up, again anonymously, to find out whether they were still alive or not in the crudest sense, whether or not they died from a liver death or a non-liver death. And I guess when you put all of that together, what then starts to come out is that of the different stages of alcohol-related liver disease, and perhaps not surprising, although this is the first time it's been kind of proven in this way, that I guess the riskiest annual risk of death comes for people that have this alcohol-associated hepatitis, so the really florid manifestation, and there's about an 11% chance, and they have much higher risk of dying from liver disease. Whereas people at the other end of the spectrum who have a fatty liver but no other fibrosis or cirrhosis still have a risk of death which is higher than perhaps we thought previously, but it seems to be non-liver death, and it's not necessarily the liver, so it might be other things that heavy drinking is also associated with. Some heavy drinkers have undoubtedly normal livers, and we still don't know why that is. What is it that protects some people from others? And that this fatty liver, although we've always assumed it was relatively benign in alcohol, actually 6% of people dying a year is not entirely benign. I guess last year I probably touched on this a little bit, so we performed a big interventional study in the UK where people being admitted with the most severe end, so the florid alcoholic hepatitis, were randomised to receive one of 4 treatments, where the treatments could be steroids, which were historically thought to be very good for calming down the inflammation, an anti-inflammatory called pentoxifylline, or placebo for either of those, so that there ended up being 4 different combinations. And the surprising thing, perhaps, was that there was absolutely no difference between any of those groups in terms of the outcomes at either 28 days or right through to a year. And again, fitting with some of the kind of concerns about how severe this is, in this hospitalised, or people who were hospitalised because of their alcoholic hepatitis, if you followed them through to a year, you'll see that overall, regardless of which treatment you got, about over 50% of them were dead. So this is 1 in 2 people dying at follow-up in a year. And there are very few cancers that have as bad a survival rate as that, to be honest. And yet again, we, rightly so, invest a lot of charity money and invest a lot of research in cancer, although not yet in alcoholic hepatitis. Since last year, we've completed this study. So this was a new medication. It was called selonsertib, which is an apoptosis signal kinase inhibitor. And the kind of biochemical bit, if you're interested, is that there seems to be some kind of cell death that happens in alcoholic hepatitis, and this was to try and inhibit that kind of cell death by giving them this drug, selonsertib, to see if it made any difference to the outcomes. And patients were randomised, so they didn't know, we didn't know, so they were randomised to either placebo and prednisolone on the bottom grey line, or this new medication and prednisolone on the top line. And they received that for 4 weeks, whether they were in hospital or to take home. It was an oral tablet, and then followed up for 6 months. And there were 45 sites around the world taking part. Again, Newcastle, the reason I'm telling you is because we were one of those sites. But again, rather disappointingly, there is no difference. So the people that got this additional drug in addition to the kind of standard of care, or what was thought to be standard of care, there was no difference in outcomes between the two statistically, and actually.
Did you look at quality of life, Steve, apart from death? Did you look at quality of life, things like fatigue and itch and stuff like that? Side effects.
So they did, and I haven't got a slide on it, so they looked at lots of kind of biochemical changes, looking for biomarkers. They did lots of laboratory studies. There was some improvements in some of those. I don't think there was any significant differences in quality of life and symptoms, partly because, again, the mortality rate was quite significant. It's 20% in the placebo one, and actually in this new drug it's up to 27%. It wasn't statistically significant that it was higher, but actually I don't think the company are going to pursue this drug in alcoholic steatohepatitis as a result of this work and this study. The next,
sobering statistics.
well, it's horrific actually. Then the next thing is maybe we're just giving it to the wrong patients, and this actually just came through today. It's just been accepted as a publication, and this is looking to see, is there something on admission that might prognosticate as to who might respond to steroids or not. And this is a very simple, it's just looking at components of your blood count, your full blood count, and looking at different types of white cells, so your neutrophils and your lymphocytes, and if your ratio of neutrophils to lymphocytes. It's thought to impact on lots of different conditions, and we've looked at it here. And the only difference that you're seeing is in the middle graph, and this is in a kind of intermediate range where if your neutrophil ratio was between 5 and 8, then the steroids seem to have a difference. If your neutrophil ratio was less than 5, you did universally very well. If your neutrophil ratio was greater than 8, you did universally very badly. So it's kind of giving us a clue that perhaps we need to be a bit more selective and look at some of the baseline characteristics that might impact on that. And then liver transplant, I guess, is the other thing that we've obviously been involved with here. I just wanted to mention one, I guess, study that we've again recently or since last year had published, and this was really to do with thinking about how organs are allocated in the first place, and I guess there's controversy in terms of how the best way to select a patient and then how the best way to allocate an organ. But for about a 10-year period, the liver transplant units in Edinburgh, Newcastle and Leeds, which were obviously the north half of the country, or the north third of the country, because actually it covered a population of about 20 million, whereas the rest of the country would be about 40 million. So we worked together in this kind of organ sharing alliance called the Northern Liver Alliance, and basically what we agreed amongst ourselves was that if a patient became adequately sick, so their scores showed that they were really needing a liver transplant soon, then in those days, for example, if Newcastle were able to retrieve an organ, we could use it in Newcastle. If Leeds retrieved an organ, they could use it in Leeds, etc. But we agreed that actually we wouldn't do that for the sickest patient, we would share them amongst the 3 centres. And that ran very successfully for about 10 years. And what this is showing here is for the patients who might be in that sicker group, and those are the ones in red, and then the patients who are in the less sick group, who are the ones in black, and the dotted lines are the NLA, and the black lines are the rest of the country. And the first graph just shows waiting list survival. So actually, although we thought it was a good idea, it didn't actually have any change in the actual overall survival on the waiting list. So that was I guess the first perhaps disappointing or surprising finding. However, what we did find was that the waiting time at the NLA centre, so there's 23 days for the sickest patients, was much shorter than the waiting time for the sicker patients elsewhere, and for the patients who were less sick. And that's what I guess this red dotted line is trying to show you here, that you're more likely to get your liver transplant sooner if you were at one of those NLA centres where we prioritised formally patients who were more sick. And so we were able to show that you can have a liver transplant quicker, but actually it didn't seem to impact on waiting list survival. Liver allocation has recently changed, so last year, last Easter, and so we're not able to do this kind of sharing amongst these alliances anymore. It's a much more national allocation scheme, and so it will be interesting to see, I guess, the impact that that has on these types of data. And then I guess just the very last thing was what Kate Holsworth was really alluding to, so a bit about other studies that are ongoing, so NAFLD. And again, this is a study that Kate and a PhD student are doing at the moment, and they're trying to see about a very low calorie diet. You might have heard some of the work that's gone on in diabetes with Roy Taylor, where they're able to reverse diabetes with patients having a 700 calorie diet, and actually they were trying to see if this was possible in people with NAFLD and to see whether it's acceptable, and then also, I guess, is it palatable? 700 calories a day is not much, and actually is that achievable? And then once you've got through the period of the very low calorie diet, what happens to your weight beyond that? And so this is a study that has been delivered successfully. They've recruited the total number of patients that they wanted. Obviously the trial's ongoing in terms of the follow-up, and basically there's an 8-week period where people take a very low calorie diet, and then the next bit is to reintroduce bits of food and then watch to see what happens subsequently. And so that's something that has already happened, and we'll have to await the results from that. And I think this is what Kate, kind of on the back of that, was then saying, well, as part of her NIHR lectureship, she's been trying to figure out if there are other tools that might help improve lifestyle choices to help with NAFLD. So I guess in terms of physical activity, sensible eating, behaviour changes that might be really important to show. They've been involved in developing this app, and I think the contact details, or a bit about how it works, practical tips, activity, steps to success, and at the moment it's not quite, I think, a research study stage. I think it's still in the kind of trialling the app and getting the app right. So if you are interested in finding out more and or trialling it, then please, Kate is very happy to be contacted directly. And again, it's another example of work that we're doing specifically in Newcastle that might ultimately make a difference.
We've got an appeal out from Kate to, for people to participate in the trial.
And you don't necessarily have to have a diagnosis.
No, you don't need to have NAFLD.
It's just to see how usable the app
Yeah.
is.
And this is
your
what happens if
opinion
you
is.
do your lifestyle intervention. You too could be doing the Great North Run. And this was me, my friend. My friend did it, I think, for what he did for LIVErNORTH.
Yeah,
This
he
was
did.
last year. And this was at the beginning, not at the end. I don't think you would have liked to see the pictures of us at the end.
That was impressive.
So I'm going to stop there, but just to say, look, there is a wide range of research ongoing in liver disease at Newcastle. Thank you for interest, for participating when you're able. There's lots of opportunities to be involved, whether it's at the setup stage, whether it's in the execution of this study stage, and I'm very happy to take any questions or clarify any issues.
I remember you mentioning, I think last time you were here, about the rise in blood donation by directing patients to blood donors. Have you managed to make that more widespread now?
So it is becoming more widespread. So the national kind of hub for blood donation have taken that up. At the moment, there's a specific drive for certain types of blood. So there'll be certain blood types that perhaps they're not having enough donation of, and there might be some blood types where they get enough. And so it's not been quite as successfully rolled out in this way as I think we'd hoped. I guess perhaps because people with genetic hemochromatosis will all be North European, Caucasian, and that may not be the types of blood that they're particularly short of. So there's a kind of genetic, ethnic thing that they're trying to clarify how they get the right levels of each blood that they want. But it is being more widespreadly done. And actually the Hemochromatosis UK and the All Parliamentary group are really kind of pushing for that as well, because it's kind of win-win for the government. If you've got a treatment, if you screen lots of patients that have this, you've got a treatment that actually then produces blood for other people, then the government have, I think, cottoned on to that it's a good idea.
How do you find patients with NAFLD? Because it's a hidden disease. People don't know they've got it, sometimes it's too late.
I mean, I think the commonest ways in which they're coming to our clinics might be in relation to other illnesses. So, for example, diabetes checkups. Quite often you'll have an annual blood test as part of that, and then the GP might notice that your liver tests have changed. Or when people have their, I guess, MOT at 40, 50, or if you're having another reason to have incidental blood tests, or people have a scan for another reason, so they might have some tummy pain, the GP arranges an ultrasound and it shows a fatty liver. So those are the main ways in which currently people are referred in. But perhaps we should be doing something different in the community to screen or to identify everyone who's got a BMI of such and such could be tested or screened for this, for example, because we know that as your body mass index increases, the likelihood of you having fatty liver and or more advanced fatty liver increases.
I mean, I spoke with people who are type 2 diabetic, and they think all they've got to do is take a pill, and life goes on if we don't change.
No, it's, you know, I guess it goes back to these quite education, and you could say, well, how do you educate people with diabetes about the risk of fatty liver, or interventions that help the diabetes that will also help fatty liver? Because I guess the irony is, if you're losing weight to help with your diabetes, you'll also help reduce your risk of having fatty liver.
Yeah, but there is a bit of a rider there as well, because in the same way that alcohol is becoming stigmatised, I genuinely feel that NAFLD is becoming stigmatised as well, because I am diabetic, I have got NASH, but my mum was diabetic, my brother was diabetic. I knew what a good diet was,
Yes.
so I always followed what I would say would be a good diet. I've never drank. You know, I don't eat a lot of Greg's pasties and drink Newcastle brown ale and stuff like that. But what the finding is that some people have a propensity to move up the stage. You know, you could be massively obese and still you might have a fatty liver, but you might not be at a stage 3 or a stage, you know, heaven forbid, a stage 4. But there's more to it than I'm not saying that lifestyle is crucial, but it's crucial in my view, in all aspects of illnesses, whether you have arthritis, you know, the lifestyle choices. But I do fear that the assumption is that it's all about your fatness.
Yeah.
And your lifestyle. You're lazy and you're fat.
And I think, you know, Professor Anstey could give another talk, and just as I was saying about alcohol, there would be genetic things that cause it, and he would give you a very eloquent talk about actually they're now getting to know which genes might predispose some of the fat deposition or the fat metabolism or the progression. I guess the issue is that you can't change your genes, so I guess it's not about being stigmatised, certainly from us, it's about changing the things that you can change, whereas if you're unlucky to have a certain genetic makeup, you can't.
But it's about that education, isn't it? And even in, you know, even GPs, I mean, I still get calls from my GP who've known me for years saying you've got a raised ALT, how's your drinking? Yeah, honestly, you know, so it is about educating people, and you on the one hand are doing one side, but who's doing the education? You know.
Then it's so difficult.
We try, don't we? Don't we?
Okay.
Could we do the name of that app?
Yes, let me move back to that one before, was it?